Well, good morning and welcome to Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV Big Fox. We're broadcasting live from the Hesselson studio here on Marcus Street in Corning. I'm your host, Frank Acom. We have a lot to get to. First of all, just a quick announcement. You may have heard by now, but the air quality today, there has been an advisory put on New York State for Monday with smoke from the Canada wildfires expected to return to the area. The governor's office has said that the air quality index in upstate New York is expected to reach levels that are unhealthy for all New Yorkers. To prepare, sensitive groups, including children under 18, adults over 65, pregnant people, and those with pre-existing conditions like heart disease or asthma are advised to stay indoors and to consider wearing an N95 or KN95 mask if they need to spend time outdoors. So there's your little bit of a public service announcement. We have a lot to get to locally this morning. As always, I want to put my contact information up there. You can reach out, weigh in on the topics we're discussing. I'm going to go through at least one comment we received over the weekend that I thought was very nice. That will come up. That'll be coming up in just a second here, so I can take that down. We also have a statement from two statements, actually, if we get to them, from Congressman Nick Langworthy that I want to mention. We're going to talk about some national issues, some presidential issues. So let's take a look first before we go to that early break. I wanted to show you this nice comment we received. Wonderful interview with Assemblyman Phil Palmisano. Yes, Phil does a really good job, and that's why I look forward to having him on very soon to have a whole show dedicated to the energy policy in New York. We've talked about the just disastrous decisions coming out of Albany, making it that you have to end the use of your gas stove, those type of things. But I'll continue. His interpretation of today's government is right on target. I definitely agree with him, and it's not the Democrat Party of our parents or grandparents. He had mentioned that during the interview because, you think of maybe a Kennedy-type Democrat. That's not the case anymore. I'm going to show you an example of that coming up in just a moment. What a competent assemblyman. I agree. Thanks again for TV, actually worth watching. Well, that's awful nice of you, and that's our goal, is to have people like Phil on to relay what's going on in Albany, keep us better informed, and I think because of the long-form interview, we get to learn a lot. I also mentioned Congressman Nick Langworthy reached out over the weekend, and I know this is a big national story. This is in regards to law enforcement announcing the successful end of the manhunt for Michael Bruham. I want to express my sincere gratitude to all the brave law enforcement officers for their efforts in safely and swiftly ending this manhunt. I also commend the exceptional collaboration between state, local, and federal authorities to ensure the safety of our communities, not only in this matter, but every day. That's a nice positive message about our law enforcement. I know that's been a common theme here on the program, talking about the media and pop culture's attack, essentially, on our law enforcement community, and then we talk about the disastrous laws again coming out of that'll be the trend, I guess, this morning, coming out of Albany, that ties the hands of our police officers. And we had a nice chat with the Assemblyman Phil Palmisano, who we just heard earlier. One viewer really appreciated the interview, and he was saying the same thing. It's disastrous on our law enforcement. It means that there's no retention. People aren't signing up. And I know I asked you a question we received from a lot of you. Would you encourage someone in your family or yourself to get into law enforcement? That's the question. It's not reflecting on the law enforcement community in general. It's about the attacks on them, the laws being put into place to make their jobs more difficult. Actually, if we get a chance, it kind of ties in, but in New York City, they're not even bothering to arrest these people that are now selling mushrooms, magic mushrooms, on the streets, in the parks, setting up a table just like you would a lemonade stand. So we may talk about that because it's going to tie into the larger picture of drugs in New York State and these illegal pot shops. We may have an opportunity to get to that because there's some news on that. But we've got to take our first break, and then we have a lot to talk about. So stay with us. This is Frankly Speaking. Oh, and we have the whole hour together. I didn't book a guest this morning just because I wanted to spend more time with you. So stay right there. We'll be right back with Frankly Speaking. I forgot to show our other camera angle. I was so excited to get right back to the program. Welcome back to Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV Big Fox. I'm your host, Frank Acom. I meant to mention this on Friday. We ran out of time because the Assemblyman gave us so much time. We had so much to focus on. But our friends from the Chemung County Historic Society sent a disappointing press release out that they are forced to cancel the Twain Country Summer Tours for 2023. Our friend Bruce Whitmarsh, who was on the program not that long ago, the director of the Chemung County Historical Society, had this to say: despite the best efforts of the Twain Tour partners, we were not able to secure a permanent driver for the bus and thus not able to guarantee that we could operate every day we planned. We at the CCHS are certainly disappointed that we will be working with our partners to develop new plans moving forward. Kind of a larger picture, isn't it? Having trouble finding people for the workforce. Okay. Now, let's get to some national news. Again, I may have an opportunity to talk a little bit about New York State issues as well, but there's a lot going on the national front. You know, we had again, I don't like polls, but it does seem like we talk about them a lot. But we had that poll not that long ago that showed that younger people would be willing to give up their right to vote as compared to giving up updates on their various social media. They would rather have the social media updates than their right to vote. Troubling start. This ties in with it. There's a new poll out, and this is coming from the New York Post. A new poll just showed how far free speech has fallen, especially among young people. If you don't appreciate your right to vote and the people that have sacrificed so much for that right, why should we expect anything less that you would not, especially with woke culture, anything less than censorship, attacks on free speech? Younger people, the woke model is you should never have to hear anything you don't like, that words are akin to violence. And there's the article. I'm not going to keep it up the whole time, but a plurality of millennials think misgendering, which is not using someone's preferred pronouns, should be criminalized. Let me try that again. Criminalized, according to a survey in Newsweek. So this is coming from Newsweek, the poll. The Redfield and Wilton Strategies poll found that 44% of those aged 25 to 34 think, quote, referring to someone by the wrong gender pronoun, meaning him, he, him, she, her, should be a criminal offense. Just 31% of this demographic disagree, while 25% are undecided. How are you undecided about something like that? The radical position is more popular than you think among those aged 35 to 44, with more of these respondents supporting the criminalization of misgendering than oppose it. So more support it than oppose it, the criminalization of misgendering someone. In a somewhat surprising twist, Gen Z respondents were significantly less likely than millennials to support pronoun censorship. I wonder if a little bit of the Gen Z was sick of the generation ahead of them always looking for censorship, looking to destroy lives because of disagreements, ruining families, friendships. Among those aged 18 to 24, only that's not the word I would use, but only 33% supported making misgendering a criminal offense. 48% disagreed. All these groups of young people were much more likely than Americans overall to support the suggested censorship. The poll found just 19% of the public overall agrees with making misgendering illegal. So the survey, and there's so many of these surveys, suggests young Americans are turning their backs on freedom of speech in pursuit of inclusivity and tolerance. So pushing censorship, attacks on free speech in the name of inclusivity and tolerance. Now, Brad Palumbo, and we're going to talk about this when we come back because I already have to take a break, but he suggests that this could backfire. Yes, obviously it could backfire, and you can see where it could be expanded anytime you have that slippery slope when there's an attack on free speech. Yes, it could lead to some very troubling trends, but remember, you can laugh at this all you want. You can say, well, those people are crazy that believe this. They're voting age. They're making major decisions that could affect us in the future. So we're going to talk just a little bit more about it when we come back. So stay with us. This is Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. Welcome back to Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. I'm your host, Frank Hakam, and we are broadcasting live from the Hesselson's studio here on a smoky Marcus Street. We were talking about the poll that came out that showed a plurality of millennials thinks that misgendering someone, which is not using that person's preferred pronoun, should be criminalized. Yes, that's right, criminalized, according to a survey done by Newsweek. So Brad Palumbo suggests that this could really backfire on these young people. The survey suggests that Americans are turning their back on freedom of speech, as I mentioned, in the name of inclusivity and tolerance. But they clearly haven't thought this out well. Well, do they? I mean, when you've seen a lot of these campaigns, do they really think it out well? It's all about their immediate gratification. I did something. I virtue signaled. I can go online and show how much I care more than you do. That it could take a dark shift towards censorship. For one, the courts would almost certainly strike down such a proposal as a violation of the First Amendment. Well, yes, you would hope so. But again, we can't laugh at this. I think the normal reaction originally in woke culture was to laugh at it and say, wow, what's next? And you come up with something really far out there, and then that would happen. So you can't just keep laughing at it. You have to take this seriously. And you've got to remember, these young people who believe this are also of voting age. So they get to pick maybe people that are more in line with their beliefs, or maybe run for office themselves. While misinformed progressives sometimes suggest otherwise, there is no hate speech exception in the First Amendment. And it clearly protects words others find offensive, even slurs. There's no reason to believe that if litigated, pronouns would be treated any differently. So they really couldn't do this even if they wanted to. Again, I don't think you just brush it off. Unless, of course, there we go. Here's the caveat. Unless, of course, progressives are successful in their attempts to pack or otherwise delegitimize our judicial system and remove its ability to block their unconstitutional proposals. But constitutional hurdles aside, young people shouldn't even want to start banning or criminalizing offensive speech. Yeah, because you've got to keep in mind, who gets to decide what's offensive? Who gets to decide what should be banned? Is it the same politicians that they claim to dislike? There are so many words, phrases, and arguments that woke young people use that conservatives or even moderates might find offensive. One example he gives is cisgendered, which is a term to describe non-transgender people, for example. But many people increasingly take issue with that label. What if they want to ban the word of cisgendered? Such a ban, which would infuriate young progressives, is really just the other side of the coin some of them want to flip. In the same vein, Gen Z has slang like okay boomer. Remember that saying? To pick on people that were older than them. Or Karen is a term that we've talked about. That's why they tried to label Mrs. DeSantis as America's Karen, because it's a derogatory term. But could that be considered ageist? Should that be banned? Finally, if your goal is actually get people to respect transgender Americans' pronouns, coercion and force aren't the way to do it. Because Americans don't like being told what to do. I think that's pretty evident. When preferred pronouns stop feeling like a request and start feeling like an order through cultural pressure or government coercion, you can expect more people to dig their heels in and refuse to go along with them, when they otherwise might have simply done so just to be polite. So young American support for the criminalization of misgendering is flawed and counterproductive in just about every way imaginable. Unfortunately, that makes it pretty typical for millennial and Gen Z political activists these days. Yes, it's all about the instant gratification, the showing that you're the most outraged. But I think you have to take that number very seriously, just like when we talked about young Americans willing to give up their right to vote as sacred right. If it means they can continue to have updates on their social media, updates on posts. It's showing a overall trend, and that's why I mention it. You can weigh in on it at any time. Let me put my contact information up there. I just found that to be kind of fascinating, coming from the New York Post. All right, moving along. Oh, did you see, speaking of offensive speech, over the weekend there was a lot of, I'm trying to find the article so that you can see it for yourself. There we go. Top House Democrats are rebuking Congressional Progressive Caucus Chair Pramila Jayapal. She called Israel a racist state. House Democrat leader Hakeem Jeffries, who we talked about not that long ago on the program, said Israel is not a racist state. A draft statement signed by a handful of other House Democrats and circulating among lawmakers' offices on Sunday expressed, quote, deep concern over what it calls Jayapal's unacceptable comments, adding, we will never allow anti-Zionist voices that embolden anti-Semites to hijack the Democrat Party and country. And this is another, you want to talk about the word trend, that we've been seeing from certain factions in the Democrat Party, this dislike or this anger towards Israel. Now, she did try to walk it back. This is her original comment, just so I don't want someone to say, well, people are taking it out of context, or I don't know the whole quote. Here's the quote. Oh, we can take that down. As somebody who's been in the streets and participated in a lot of demonstrations, I want you to know that we have been fighting to make it clear that Israel is a racist state, that the Palestinian people deserve self-determination and autonomy, that the dream of a two-state solution is slipping away from us, that it does not even feel possible. So that's her full quote. Now, she sought to clarify it Sunday afternoon, saying that she does not believe the idea of Israel as a nation is racist, and offering I don't know, is this considered an apology? She said she apologizes to those who I have hurt with my words. That doesn't feel like an actual apology, but yeah, you'll have a letter circulating, some people sign off and condemn what she said. But there's definitely, again, a faction in the Democrat Party that holds these kind of anti-Israel beliefs, because it's not the first time certain people on the progressive wing have said similar. Okay, we've got to take another short break. Stay with us. We'll be back with Frankly Speaking. I told you, we're going to cover a lot this morning. We're just getting started, so stay right there. This is Frankly Speaking on WYDC TV. Big Fox will be right back. Early voting. This is specifically from the Times-Union and Chris Churchill. Let me put that up on the screen for you. A new law recently passed by the state legislature would allow New Yorkers to vote by mail without reason or excuse. Democrats who control the legislature say expanding voting by mail is about respecting democracy and ensuring voters are heard. Who could be against it? It'd be like taking a stand against baseball, an apple pie, right? Says Chris Churchill. There's just one problem. The proposal ignores the will of voters. 2 years ago, a statewide ballot question asked New Yorkers if they wanted to change the state's Constitution to allow no excuse absentee balloting. Voters rejected the idea 55% to 45%. Well, what happens in Albany and in Washington if they don't get their way? Just ignore the will of the people. So if you're keeping score, Democrats are claiming an interest in expanding democracy while ignoring actual democracy. In other words, voters spoke out, but lawmakers didn't like the outcome. And rather than holding a second referendum, the right way of doing it, even though I don't think that's right, it's already been voted on once, and working to convince voters they're doing what they're doing, they instead do an end run around the will of the electorate. Senator Mike Gianaris, a Democrat from Queens, said it's a legal fine line to be sure. The referendum, he told me, this again, Chris Churchill with the Times-Union, centered on absentee voting, while the new legislation relates to a form of early voting. And I remember talking about this with the assemblyman. It was either Phil or Chris Friend, that it's, again, completely ignoring the will of the people. And you got to remember in Albany, where there's a supermajority of Democrats, they're only used to getting their way. So when they don't, ignore you, the voter. The referendum, as I mentioned, it's a little different, right, than what they claim. He says, is there really a tangible difference? In both cases, the issue is whether voters should be allowed to vote by mail ahead of Election Day without having to explain to the local Board of Elections that they'll be in Paris or Tacoma. Under the legislation, which still needs the governor's signature to become law, voters could apply online for a mail ballot. Privately, many Democrats say they don't believe the 2021 results reflected the will of the voters. Advocates for mail-in voting and other rejected changes on the ballot were caught sleeping, they believe, while opponents focused attention on the measure and spent heavily to defeat them. Much of that is true, says Mr. Churchill, but all elections are impacted by turnout and spending and attention, all of them. If we're going to discount the results after the fact, what's the point of holding an actual election? That's a very great point. And what message is being sent to voters? Yeah, at a time when a lot of people don't vote because they believe their vote doesn't matter. Well, Albany, I guess, is proving that. You could argue that New York's historically low turnout results, at least in part from voters' belief that the outcome doesn't matter and lawmakers don't listen to them, proving that cynicism right seems a dubious way to boost future turnout. It seems more likely to depress turnout. What the Democrats are doing is really an insult to the voters, said John Faso, a former Republican gubernatorial candidate. Oh, I forgot about him. Who pays close attention to state election law. Quote, the voters did say something. I guess I'm not surprised. I'm upset about it, ignoring the will of the people in the name of democracy. But when it comes to decisions made by Albany, are any of you surprised that if they didn't get their way, they just ignore what the voters had to say? Well, and speaking of New York, we have a few things to get to. Why don't we stick with New York, and then we'll go to the national stuff around the halfway point. How's that? But it should come as no surprise. And Albany, Democrats specifically, really like this mail-in ballot. I know it's open to a lot of fraud, a lot of questionable votes, but they like this no excuse needed absentee ballot. So they didn't get what they wanted from the voters, and they just decided to go ahead and do it anyway. Should you be outraged? Absolutely. But I guess Albany's banking on the fact that hopefully you're not paying attention, and that's why we're bringing it up to you, because we know that you are paying attention, and you want all that information. They don't want you to know. Also about New York, a disastrous rollout of the legalization of marijuana. It's a topic that we've talked about numerous times on this program, starting from the earliest days. Handled it so poorly. And the Daily News did a piece on it over the weekend. And I mentioned earlier in the program that drugs, specifically in the city, but in all of our communities in New York, are just running rampant. And it's got to the point now where they are selling mushrooms out on the street in New York City. We'll talk about that in just a second. But the Daily News supported the legalization of cannabis. They want you to know that. They want to lay down that caveat right at the beginning. But the way the state of New York has gone about it seems that they are intentionally trying to sabotage the reform. It does look that bad, doesn't it? It's very frustrating that more than 2 years since marijuana became legal on March 31st, 2021, that there are only 15 legitimate pot shops in the state, just 15 in the whole state, and just 7 of them in the city of New York, the city of 8 million people. In Brooklyn, the biggest county in the Eastern time zone, there are 0. Likewise, on Staten Island. There are 1 each in Queens and the Bronx, and all 5 in Manhattan are downtown within a 10-minute walk of each other. Is that Albany's idea of the pot district? Yeah, it's been a disastrous rollout, really, from the beginning. But don't worry, there are plenty of places to buy pot. It's available on every corner. Sometimes several illegal drugs on a corner, or illegal shops, or there's a van or 2 parked on the street selling it. The cops have estimated that there are 1,700 illegal pot shops in the city alone. But someone who knows this situation extremely well puts the real number closer to 4,000. Because you've got to remember, all these places that you've seen around maybe your neck of the woods, they're illegal. They're not paying taxes. Yeah, but anyway, we'll continue. Why the big disparity in the numbers? It may be that cops only counted the smoke shops, pre-existing ones that started selling pot, and new ones. But there are plenty of bodegas and other small markets illegally peddling pot. And then they'll bust one in the city, and then they'll have a big press conference out there. And according, again, this is an opinion piece by the Daily News, they said the Keystone Cops approach isn't funny. Since you can't sell booze without a license, try opening up a sidewalk lemonade stand that also sells whiskey. And I thought that's why I mentioned this piece. That's such a great comparison. It would last, maybe 10 minutes? I don't even know if you'd get 10 minutes before you'd be shut down and put into jail. While the legal shops remain rare, new illegals keep popping up. but some really strong padlocks and seal these places up tight. So their idea is that it went so poorly for the state that it actually looks like they're sabotaging it. Could ruin the positive feelings that people maybe originally had about legalizing marijuana. It has run amok, and as I mentioned, and we do have to take a short break here in just a second, but it's so bad that in New York City, drug dealers are openly selling mushrooms in Washington Square Park. We already know that they're having a major crime issue in New York, a lot to do with bail reform. We know that there's a homelessness problem, drug use rampant, with new drugs, it seems like, coming out almost daily, violence in the streets. This week, makeshift tabletops draped with tie-dye blankets and psychedelic printings were covered with the usual illicit fare of pre-rolled joints and weed-infused edibles, but also jars and Ziploc bags stuffed with knobby, dried-out mushrooms. Aggressive vendors barked out prices. "I got shrooms, $40 for an eighth," one hollered, while stunned tourists, unsuspecting college students, and silver-haired residents navigated the maze of psychedelic sellers amid a thick haze of weed smoke. A baby-faced dealer who went by the name Euphoria called out to a reporter from his benchside location, saying that he was offering $40 for an eighth ounce of the strain. And I don't want to say the name of the strain. And then when they tried to interview the person, take a picture, they threatened to get violence. Law enforcement, in the meantime, didn't appear to make much effort to crack down on the flagrant drug dealing in Washington Square Park. Does that tie in with the bail reform? You figure they go through all that mess, all that paperwork. You know, it's a good part of their day. For what? Those people will be back on the streets selling them before that police officer has filled out all the paperwork. So you almost can't blame a police officer for just walking by and saying, "What's the sense? What's the sense of putting all that on my plate, all that work for nothing?" Over the course of an afternoon this week, a pair of Parks Enforcement Patrol officers only briefly spoke with one vendor whose signs even advertised mushrooms, telling him simply to keep his joints hidden for public view. The police and the PEP officers are supposed to do stuff about it, but they don't, said one longtime resident. They walk right past and they don't do a thing. Why do I mention this? I know it's the city. Well, who would have thought we'd be talking about illegal pot shops in all of our neighborhoods? So it's just something to keep in mind. Is that a trend that could trickle to upstate? Well, apparently if there's money involved, you can never write it off. All right, we have to take a short break. Stay with us. This is Frankly Speaking. Again, I want to remind you, you can contact me if you want to weigh in on all of these issues or other issues. What do you want to talk about this morning? This is Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV. Big Fox will be right back after this short break. We are back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV. Big Fox, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Frank Acom. We don't have an interview scheduled for today, but I'd like to thank M.A. Neal Financial Services for sponsoring that section when we do. We do have a great lineup all week. Just Monday, I thought we'll have a lot to catch up on, so I thought I'd just spend the time with you. For whatever reason, we went from one drug story to another. If you're just joining us, we were talking about the illegal pot shops here in New York. But, of course, last week, the big topic was cocaine in the White House. Well, in certain circles. Some mainstream media did not want to report on it. And essentially, it all went down exactly like expected, with no information. Miranda Devine at the New York Post said the whole thing is preposterous. Of all excuses offered by the Secret Service to explain why they shut down the White House cocaine investigation last week, after just 11 days, one jumped out as particularly ridiculous. They couldn't conduct interviews of potential cokeheads known to be in the vicinity of where the bag of drugs was found because they didn't want to infringe on their civil rights. That's what a Secret Service spokesman said. We have no evidence to approach them, he said, of 500 possible guests, or possible suspects, if you will, identified in the area on the holiday weekend before July 4th. Miranda Devine says, tell that to the hundreds of people rounded up by the FBI for just being in the vicinity of the Capitol on January 6, 2021. Sorry, nobody believes that the Biden administration cares about safeguarding civil liberties unless it's part of a cover-up. Yes, that does seem like a pretty lame excuse. And this is Miranda Devine from the New York Post, if you're just joining us. They didn't find anyone because they didn't want to find anyone, says former NYPD Commissioner Bernie Kerik. Despite enlisting the help of the FBI, the Secret Service found no fingerprints or DNA evidence on the bag of cocaine. So, according to Kerik, whoever had the cocaine, they wore gloves. Is that what we're supposed to believe? And the fact that they have changed the location 3 times makes it evident they are trying to conceal and suppress where it was actually found. I'm so glad he mentioned that, because that's one of the things about this story that got very confusing. You would hear different locations almost every time you turned on the TV or every time there was an update of where this was actually found. Sometimes it made it sound like it was almost in the lobby of a tourist area. And then we found out it was right by the Situation Room. So, yeah, they changed location 3 times. Shut down the investigation after 11 days. And I know I said this last week, but I think it's worth reiterating that what kind of message does this send to bad guys? Meaning that they shut down the White House thinking that could potentially be anthrax. So what does this say if they can't track down who brought cocaine into the White House? God forbid it was something of a security threat that someone brought in and just left in a cubby. So this shows a very weakened message from the Secret Service. One of what I thought was the most secure building perhaps in the world. We're being told you can't find out, with all the cameras, with all the technology, they can't find out who brought that. We're supposed to believe that. But again, the message that it sends that our Secret Service is weak in their investigative skills and their security. I mean, there should be an investigation by Congress into how we improve, apparently, security at the White House, and maybe why the Secret Service shut down after just 11 days of investigation into who brought cocaine in the White House. Because again, what does that say to adversaries? That we're not more secure at the White House than that. Even more astonishing is that a complex bristling with security cameras, the Secret Service found no surveillance video footage existing because the baggie was located in a, quote, blind spot. Kerik, the former NYPD commissioner, said, I don't care if it was a 6-foot blind spot. I could tell you who walked into and who walked out of it. This whole blind spot argument is bogus. He claims, in his belief, the Secret Service knows exactly whose cocaine it is. They don't miss anything. They know their job. They are very systematic, very organized, very thorough. The whole thing is preposterous. It's really an insult to the men and women in the Secret Service and the FBI for them to say they can't identify where the cocaine came from. Yes, because if you think about Secret Service, if they can't protect in the White House, what happens when they're out in public in new locations? If they can't track down who brought cocaine into the White House and left it there, then what does that say when you are at an event? When the president has to go to a big city or do a stump speech somewhere. Even former Russiagate federal prosecutor Andrew Weissman says the investigation is a joke. It's such bad law enforcement, and frankly, I would say suspicious. You interview people, but you know what you don't do before you interview people? Publicly say there's no DNA evidence and no fingerprints. Like, why would you let the whole world know that you're not going to interview people? Better for people to think that you might have that. But according to the Secret Service, there are just too many people to interview. Anyway, cocaine possession is a misdemeanor in the District of Columbia. So basically, who cares? Shut up and stop asking questions. That's sending the wrong message from the White House. As Miranda Devine said, Nancy Reagan would be rolling over in her grave. When it comes to the important work carried out in the White House, it is a national security problem if the staff are drugged out and so sloppy that they leave their cocaine just lying around. Yeah, just one of many parts of the security issues regarding this. And as to the Secret Service, if your job is to protect the president, how far do you go? See, these are where the conspiracy theories start to pop up. Carrick thinks eventually the truth will leak because the men and women in the federal law enforcement arena are sick and tired of having to conceal and suppress and basically commit crimes on behalf of the Biden White House. When we get back, we'll talk a little bit, just quickly. Trump weighed in on the Secret Service over the weekend. He gave some interviews. We're going to talk a little bit about DeSantis. We still have a lot to cover, so stay with us. This is Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV. Big Fox will be right back. We are back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV. Big Fox, thanks so much for joining us this morning. I really appreciate it. We're talking about the cocaine in the White House. Former President Donald Trump was on Sunday Morning Futures on Fox, and he says, you know how many cameras they have opposite the front door of the Situation Room? He said, I've gotten to know the Secret Service really well, and I can't speak more highly of these people. They're incredible people. I believe that they know everything. They're really smart and good at what they do. I don't think it's possible for bags of cocaine to be left in a certain area in the Situation Room, Trump said. I'm not talking about 5 blocks away. The Situation Room, where you decide on war, where you decide on nuclear. And that's a good point back to mine, where the security implications there. All right, so that was the former president. He was on Fox this Sunday. We may talk a little bit more about that. Democrats have some issues that they're dealing with within the party, looking at some third-party potential that could disrupt the presidential election with Cornel West, or now Joe Manchin speaking in New Hampshire, I believe over the weekend, raising the concern of many Democrats. We'll talk about that when we come back, but I do already have to take a short break, and then we'll be back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. We are back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox, broadcasting live from the Hesselson's studio here on Marcus Street in Corning. Just a reminder, there is that smoke advisory for today because of the wildfires in Canada, so keep that in mind. If you can stay in, please do. If not, you can wear a mask, just like in the early days of COVID. Okay, Democrats believe they have a man problem, according to Politico. I'm not going to get too much into this. I found it interesting, though. So they have experts that are talking about how they can fix it, but they do say that not only do they have a masculinity messaging problem, but should they even want to change that quote-unquote problem? It's hard to deny that Democrats have a masculinity problem. Attitudes towards masculinity have been an important predictor of votes for Donald Trump. And while Black and Latino voters still overwhelmingly lean Democrat, men in those communities are turning to Republicans at higher rates than women. Republicans seem all too happy to capitalize on the gun-toting, fist-pumping tropes of stereotypical manhood. GOP presidential candidates are bragging about their athletic prowess. Missouri Senator Josh Hawley's recent book, Manhood, The Masculine Virtues America Needs, joins a body of Let Men Be Men work. And then they go on to name some far out there bloggers and influencers that I just don't tend to agree with. But as they approach elections with razor-thin margins, what are Democrats to do? Recruit candidates who fit traditional stereotypes of manhood? Confront Republican arguments head-on with alternative takes on crime, guns, transgender rights, and vision of masculinity that intersects with all those issues? Or just do nothing and hope voters are turned off by GOP rhetoric that they see as toxic or discriminatory? So is it a problem or isn't it? Politico kind of twisting itself up into a knot there. I am not going to give you their overall opinions because it is 14 pages having that discussion. 14. They must be concerned. Now, they're also very concerned about a third party. There's a piece at Politico, same organization, that says the Electoral College is the big factor in a third-party nightmare for Democrats. It gets a little bit wonky and in the weeds on this, but you can find that for yourself at Politico. I know I've got to take a short break already, but No Labels recently hosted Senator Joe Manchin and former Republican Utah Governor Jon Huntsman at an event in New Hampshire. That's coming up, next week. And No Labels isn't the only one. Academic Cornel West, who we mentioned earlier in the month, is jockeying for the Green Party nomination. But there is one point of solace for Democrats. Voters in battleground states have been less likely to vote third party in recent elections than those less competitive states. Now, CNN said that Manchin's New Hampshire trip will leave Democrats shivering. Now, he does face re-election in the Senate next year, but has not yet said whether he'll run on a third-party ticket or for Senate. It says, staking out ground to the right of his party and attracting a political spotlight he uses to maximize his influence. Last year, for instance, Manchin's initial refusal to back a massive climate, tax, and social safety net plan forced President Joe Biden to scale back and renegotiate a huge piece of his domestic agenda. So it could be a threat there. Many are saying that a Manchin campaign, third-party campaign, would hurt Biden more than it would hurt Republicans. I would tend to agree with that, but I could see some people on the more moderate Republican Party maybe considering a Joe Manchin presidency, or at least the vote. All right, we've got to take a short break. Stay with us. We'll be back, and then we're going to wrap things up here on Frankly Speaking on WYDC TV, Big Fox. We are back with Frankly Speaking here on WYDC TV, Big Fox. Just wrapping things up here at the end as we wind down. Donald Trump spoke at Turning Point Actions conference over the weekend. In their straw poll, he received 87.5% of the attendees. About 3,000 attendees responded to the poll. DeSantis came in third behind, I think, a businessman, Perry Johnson. So Trump with 85.7, Perry Johnson with 7.8, Ron DeSantis with 4.3%. Now, over the weekend, specifically on Sunday, the former president was on Sunday Morning Futures. They said, basically, what do you think was your biggest mistake in your time in office? He said the mistake would be people. I mean, I wouldn't have put a guy like Bill Barr, and he was weak and pathetic. I wouldn't have put Jeff Sessions. And there are some people that I wouldn't have put in. You know, most people were good, but I had some people. We had Esper. I didn't like him. He was incompetent. I thought we had other people I didn't like. So Maria Bartiromo said, well, why'd you put him in the job? He said, you put somebody in and you think they're going to be good. All of a sudden, I'm the president of the United States, and it's like a different society. I was New York, and, it was a different thing. So I didn't know people. I became president. I'm riding around Pennsylvania Avenue with our first lady. I had 250 motorcycles. I had armies. I had everything. I said, do you believe it? We're president. Take a look. This is wild, right? But I never was involved in that. So anyway, he did say he did a pretty good job of draining the swamp, but more work could be done. He also said that he would be interested in putting Tim Scott, who was also running for president, Tim Scott in his administration if he is victorious. Is there anyone on the stage you see as potential running mate? He didn't say specifically running mate. He said, but about Tim Scott, he said, I think he's a very good guy, and we did opportunity zones together. It's never been talked about. It's one of the most successful economic development things ever done in this country, and Tim is very good. I mean, I could see Tim doing something with the administration, but he's in right now campaigning. But Tim is a talented guy, and you have other talented people as well. He has yet to say if he will participate in the first Republican primary debate, which is right around the corner. He said, I haven't really made up my mind. Interesting. So that is, Ron DeSantis has fired roughly a dozen staffers in a campaign shakeup. Surprisingly, kind of in a cash crunch here. He had too many people on the staff. If you want to look at the numbers, he just hired too many people off the jump. So letting some people go. We know last week he's changed his media strategy as well. We are out of time for today's edition of Frankly Speaking. Boy, that went fast. We covered a lot. I thank you so much for joining us, and make sure you join us tomorrow morning starting at 7 a.m. for Frankly Speaking right here on WYDC TV Big Fox. I'm Frank Akam. We will see you tomorrow morning.